Hey watch friends, today we're going to check out an offering from the microbrand Karmann, and this is their Rally Sports. In case like me, you were not familiar with this brand, this is the sister brand of Feynman that we've checked out in the past. As far as the basic information, first, this is available for direct order right now on their affiliate website, and I'll of course have a link down in the video description. As far as the basic specs, this comes standard with a 2-year warranty. The case size, measured from roughly the 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock, is coming in dead on at 40 millimeters. The bezel is pretty much spot on flush, and I'm getting 40 millimeters on my calipers there as well. The lugs are a strap change friendly 20 millimeters. The lug to lug is a reasonably compact 46.8 millimeters. The total thickness is a little bit on the thicker side, coming in at 13.7 millimeters, and we'll unpack that further as we go throughout. That is inclusive of this flat sapphire crystal, which does feature inter-AR coating. As far as the movement, this is a first for me. This is the Epson YN55A, which is essentially the Orient F6922, which for those not familiar like myself, that is an automatic movement. It does have hacking, hand winding, 40-hour power reserve, all that kind of good stuff. As far as the water resistance, this comes with 200 meters or 20 atmospheres of water resistance, plenty respectable there. The weight, this is firmly in the middleweight category, coming in at 150.5 grams, so 150.5, and that is on this bracelet sized to my 6.5-inch wrist. So now that we have the basic specs out of the way, let's go ahead and get a better feel for the actual model. First, for the colors, this is really technically in this Rally Sports configuration only available in blue. However, there are two corollaries for that, where there's also a red version, as well as a black special edition version as well. With the finishing on this, you're going to notice that the dial is what I would describe as like a satin fume, so it has a nice gradient application to this blue color on this particular variant. You're going to notice that it does have printing at the 12 o'clock position with the brand name, as well as Rally Sports at the 6 o'clock, and that is in an accent color for the sports portion. Over at the 3 o'clock position, you'll see that this does have an integrated date window as well. Shifting out to the chapter ring, this is one of the areas where you're going to see the nod towards that Rally Sport namesake. So this actually features a checkered flag kind of embossing around that, which really does give that Rally Sport kind of vibe. But then in between that, you are going to notice that there are white hashes as well. So it does give you your precision legibility for your minutes and seconds. Shifting over to the hardware on this, or the handset on this, is what I would describe as being a custom pencil style handset. So you're going to notice that this has horizontal brushing, which is a very fine brushing, and depending on the way the lighting is hitting it, it almost looks like a satin finish to that. However, it does appear to have very fine brushing. This is going to be blunted at the tips, so not a traditional pencil configuration. And then additionally, you'll notice it does have skeletonization at the base, which I think that's a neat little accent touch there. Shifting over to the second hand, you're going to see a similar finishing, except that this does now add a complementary accent color to match with the sports on the dial as well. And you can see this has a nice blocky kind of lollipop tip out at the end there. And then we're going to see as we shift over to the markers that blockiness carries over in the theme. And I think that this fits with the checkering and the overall aesthetics. We'll see those lines throughout here. But the markers themselves, in addition to being the blocky construction as well, you're going to see at your 12, 6, and 9 o'clock position where those are going to be more prominent. At the 3 o'clock position, you do have more prominent, however, it is chopped down to accommodate that date window there. And then in between those, you're going to see skinnier, less accented markers there. Shifting over to the loom. The loom application on this, especially for being the style of watch that it is actually plenty strong. You know, this really has a good performance overall. It has a pretty generous application across the hands as well as the markers. Certainly not one that I would say is the strongest I've ever seen, but it definitely, I think, is respectable for what you're getting. And then as you move this across lighting conditions, you can start to get accents of that blue coloration. It is a pretty deep and saturated blue overall, especially depending on the way the light is hitting it. It'll pick up more of that kind of gradient effect and actually darkens up even to the center, and that's a pretty cool accent. As far as the bezel on this is a little bit deceiving. So it looks at first glance like this is going to be a rotating bezel. And in fact, we'll actually check this out next to a Zello Swordfish, which has a very similar bezel construction to this. However, this is actually a fixed bezel construction. They just went for that kind of stylistic aesthetic for it. So that does not rotate there. The exterior of the bezel, as you can see, it is principally going to be polished, and it does have kind of gear cuts into that, which is part of what gives the appearance or the illusion of being a rotary bezel. As far as the bezel insert, you can see that this has a sapphire insert. And again, this carries through with kind of that checkered flag kind of aesthetic there with alternating blue and black, which is, again, complementary to that dial. But then additionally, though, with the overall theme as far as that rally, it does give that very racing rally kind of aesthetic to that. And then you're going to see it does have your 10-minute numerals. And as we already saw there, those do have lume applied to those as well. Shifting over to the case on this is what I would describe as being somewhat of a slab kind of construction. Certainly it does have breaks to that with the chamfers and otherwise. However, overall, to me, this gives that very aesthetic, aesthetic and vibe that you would get from a slab construction. The finishing is going to be vertical brushing, so you can see it runs up and down along the case as opposed to front to rear on the case. And that, it isn't always my favorite there. I personally prefer a horizontal, however, I think it works well enough here. You can see, as we already talked about, that this does have an undercut, and that is going to just carry through with that brushing kind of finish there on the underside. But that does visually slim it out a little bit, though it does actually add to accent where it almost seems like the case back is thicker than it actually is because that kind of tapers down to that. So it seems like it has a fairly thick case back, even though the case back itself, as we'll see here, isn't the thickest. However, none of this is overly thin either. As far as the overall lines, you can see that this does have pretty pronounced downturn to the lugs, and it does actually come just a little bit proud of the caseback. So even though the caseback is on the deeper side, this does still have that where it flows down, and we'll see it on the wrist here momentarily. As you move out to the edges, you can see that this does feature drilled lugs as well. So that's going to be nice because this does not include quick release spring bars, but you can still change the straps around easily there. As we get to the silhouette, you can see this has somewhat chunky, though I would say pretty proportionate for the lugs, but then this does have polished accents on the edge, so you can see that kind of chamfer cut with the polishing there. You do have a curved case with, of course, a fitted end link for that, and we'll check that out further. And then shifting over to the crown side, you can see that this does not have a crown guard, which again, I think is in keeping with that overall kind of racy vibe and aesthetic. As far as the crown itself, this is coming in at 6.3 millimeters, and it is a screw-down construction. So even though this isn't a dive watch, they did go with that, and that's part of getting the 200 meters of water resistance, and I think that was a good call. The styling, you can see for the mill cuts, this is going to be somewhat similar to the bezel. Certainly it's a tighter gear cut than that is, but it does carry over with that kind of gear aesthetic. And then finishing wise, this is going to be a combination of brushing and polishing for the finish accents there. And then as you can see, this is signed on the exterior as well. Shifting over to the caseback, again, in somewhat keeping with the sort of dive styling of this, even though it isn't a dive watch, this one does have a screw-in caseback. The caseback itself is going to be a full polished construction, and then the main thing that you're going to notice is that it does have that rally car etching in text here on the back as well, which, it's a lot more polished than I like on the caseback, especially because you pick up all the oils and all those kinds of things in usage. However, I do think that is a cool aesthetic with the etching there, and really gives that nod to the rally car. As far as the thickness, as we already talked about, this is relatively thick for the caseback, not overly so, but with that case aesthetic that we already looked at, that does tend to visually thicken that up some. Shifting over to the on-wrist presence, here on my 6.5-inch wrist, as you can see, it definitely isn't the thinnest in the world, so it does sit a little bit thick. I don't think it's terribly so, but certainly it is not one that's going to disappear on your wrist. The weight is right in the middleweight category, and as we'll look at, this does have good articulation, and it is comfortable overall, and actually wears its weight well, but it is definitely a bit thick. As far as the construction, it is going to be 20 millimeters at the lugs, and then it does taper down to 18 millimeters at the clasp. It has a male end link, as you can see there, and additionally, the construction is a 3-link configuration. It's what I would describe as like a president style from Rolex or otherwise, with the semicircles for the links, which that gives a unique look compared to like the typical Oyster 3-link configuration. So I think that suits this well here. The finishing is going to be brushing, running the full length of the links as well as on the exterior, and this is held in with screws. So if you do need a quality screwdriver, I'll have one, of course, linked down the video description. Highly encourage you to pick one up. I'll also have a link in there if you need any help to not strip those out or anything like that. As I already mentioned, the articulation on this is surprisingly really good. This reminds me kind of like almost a beads of rice, the way that it just has great individual link articulation, and that's both lateral and horizontal. It really just drapes nicely and has good movement across the board, and that really lends to comfort. Additionally, it's well chamfered on the inside as well, so it just really has a silky feel that's quite satisfying on the wrist. I've actually been very surprised and pleased with that because it seems a bit chunky. I wasn't expecting that. As far as the clasp, this is a traditional basic clasp here. So you're going to see it does have a fold over keeper, and then once you pop that open, you do have a double pusher construction with a relatively short clasp. It does have 3 micro adjust holes on the exterior, and it does have a milled bridge on the inside. So it's a pretty decent construction overall, but again, fairly basic for that. All right, so now that we have all that out of the way, let's go ahead and bring in some comps before we wrap things up. First, as I already mentioned earlier, I would bring in a Zelos Swordfish. This is specifically Swordfish 40 to give you comp here. As you can see, the Karmann does, I think, present larger, and that's partly owing to this has thicker on the bezel, and this is an actual rotary dive style bezel. But I wanted to give you an idea as far as the aesthetics, and then this is, of course, that Zelos Teal, which is one of the colors they're known for. Next to this blue, you can just see kind of the radiance there for that. But these, I think, have relatively similar kind of angles and aesthetic, though on the Zelos, you can see it is a little more sharp as far as some of those angles. And overall, it does visually, like I said, have a little more thinness to it than this does as well, despite the fact that these are going to be, this is a thicker movement with the NH series, overall aesthetics, I think, is fairly similar between these. All right, so next here we have next to a Henry Archer, this is their Aqua, just gives you another idea. Again, this is a 40 millimeter dive style, but with this being somewhat of a dive style bezel, gives you an idea here as far as sizing. I think they're fairly comparable as far as presence there. You can see the Aqua is much thinner for this, and that does have a Miota 9 series to help with that. And then here it is next to an RZE, this is their Endeavor, again, a 40 millimeter in a dive style, but again, with a thinner dive style bezel, to give you an idea of visual presence there. And you can see again, here's the thinness, and this is again another NH based watch. So this I do think could have been thinned out some, and we'll talk about that here momentarily. But with that, let's go ahead and actually wrap things up with my personal view of the positives, critiques, as well as the summary. First, for the positives, the pricing is pretty inexpensive on this. It's coming in approximately $302 as of time of recording here. I believe that is a sale price for it, but it's very inexpensive overall. As we already talked about, as far as the bracelet, the articulation on that is excellent. Really impressed with the comfort that you get from this bracelet. It feels nice and silky on the wrist, great articulation, great drape, all those kind of things, and that really makes it a much more enjoyable watch to wear. And then the legibility. On this particular variant, which as I said, this is really the only Rally Sports, this blue with then having the white accents there, really great at a glance legibility. The handset's pretty bold, especially with that hour hand. You can really just look quickly. You got great contrast for that. So very nice legibility. There is the asterisk to that of with having that checker on the chapter ring, it does distract a little bit from seeing those hashes. So as far as precision legibility isn't quite as great, but at a glance legibility is excellent. But what about some critiques? We already talked about it a lot, so I knew that this one was going to be coming, and that is the thickness. Definitely think that this could have been thinner than it is, and I'm not entirely certain why it is as thick as it is, but I do definitely think that it is chunkier than I would prefer. It's not prohibitively so, and certainly I've worn thicker watches, but this one for me just feels thicker than it needs to be. The finishing, for the $300 price point, I think is fine. It is what I would describe as average finishing. It's nothing that I'm overly impressed with. The lines are fine, the brushing's fine, the polishing's fine, all those kind of pieces, but it feels to me like a $300 watch. So I think it is acceptable for what you're getting. It definitely does not punch above its class like something like, say, the Henry Archer, or actually that Zelos Swordfish, which that for sub $300 when they originally launched that one, I mean, to me, it's no comparison. The Zelos is, I think, better finished of a watch at a lower price point, so stronger value, but this I still think is respectable for what it is. And then finally, as we're to look at that clasp, with having a traditional clasp on this, I'm always going to want to see a toeless micro adjust clasp. We have gotten spoiled by those. So with having the traditional on this, that's a bit of a letdown. However, at the price point, I think it's understandable, though the Zelos, again, did on their later variant of that had the sapphire bezel insert as well, I believe included a toeless micro adjust on that. So it certainly can be done at a comparable price point, and that's something I would have liked to have seen. So where does that leave us? Overall, this one I think is going to be somewhat of a niche styling, and that is true of Feynman as well. Feynman, I will say, goes for a little more of the elegance, a little more refinement, though it is obviously at a higher price point as well. I've got to say, I'm personally partial to the Feynman offerings that I've checked out in the past over this one. This is really in the niche market for somebody who's looking for a somewhat unique racy styled watch. Rally Sports is something that I've always thought is cool, but I've never been hugely into, so I can't say that I'm necessarily the target demographic for this one. However, I think as a watch and on a standalone basis, I think it is just fine for what you're getting. So I think certainly if this is something that you're into and you like this particular style, then I don't think you can go wrong with it, especially at the $300 price point. But we've already unpacked everything else that goes into that. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. If you did like it, please do tap that like button. If you haven't already done so, smash that subscribe button. Finally, drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. Do you like this one? Do you like one of the other options better? Or would you pick another model altogether? Thanks for watching.